No other announcements. We invite you this evening, if you have your Bibles, turn to the 9th chapter of the book of Matthew. We're continuing in our series, What Would Jesus Do? And that was the fight or the craze a few years back, WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? And they had bracelets. The whole beginning of that was Charles Sheldon published a book in 1896 called In His Steps. He was moved so to do so when a homeless man paid their church a visit and pretty much got on to him, and he died a few days later. So it so moved Pastor Raymond, or rather Pastor Maxwell of the First Baptist Church of Raymond in Eastern America. It so moved him that he proposed to his church that for a whole year they don't do anything unless they first ask the question, what would Jesus do? So we're considering some scriptural messages on what Jesus would do. And tonight we see that Jesus would change things. Now Matthew 9 verses 1 through 17. And he entered into a ship and passed over and came into his own city. And behold, they brought to him a man sick of the palsy lying on a bed. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. And behold, certain of the scribes said within themselves, This man blasphemeth. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Wherefore think you evil in your hearts? For whether it is easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or say, Arise and walk. But that you may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, then saith he to the sick of the palsy, Arise, take up thy bed, and go into thine house. And he rose and departed to his house. But when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God, which had given such power unto men. And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew, sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, Follow me. And he rose and followed him. And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, Why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? But when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, for I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not? And Jesus said unto them, Can the children of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then they shall fast. No man putteth a piece of new cloth unto old garment. For that which is put in to fill it up taketh from the garment, and the rent is made worse. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out. The bottles perish, but they that put new wine into new bottles are both are preserved. You know, sometimes we forget the kind of challenges that Jesus presented to those of his day. And he really did. And he said some radical things. And he challenged their preconceived notions of who could forgive sin by healing the paralytic. And he challenged their presuppositions of what faith could do when he healed the bleeding woman and raised a little girl from the dead. And he challenged their prejudice by calling and cavorted with sinners and tax collectors like Matthew. And he challenged the pride of the religious leaders by saying that it wasn't enough just to patch up their traditions, but a whole new way was needed. Now, first of all, Jesus would change preconceived notions. That is in verses 1 through 8. Now, in the account of Mark, this is the same paralytic that was let down through the roof of the house by his friends to be healed by Jesus. They were bound and determined there was no way to get into the house, and I have heard that it might have been Peter's house, but I'm not sure on that. But anyway, they could not get into into the house there for their friend to be healed. So they cut a hole in the roof and let him down. So we see here that they had a very great faith. If you can't get in one way, go another. We see here Jesus both healed the man and forgave him of his sins. Healing and the forgiveness of sins are related. Now, in Palestine, it was a universal belief that sin and sickness were related. In other words, if you were sick, you were suffering for some kind of sin. I believe that to a point. And to be honest, I grew up believing it. And I say to a point. I think many people do suffer as a result of sin in terms of sickness. And I've got a good illustration here in just a minute to prove that. But I am of the conclusion that not all sickness is a result of sin. Now, I guess you could argue, maybe kind of perhaps, if you look at the fallen creation, that you could make an argument that it's all the result of sin. But I would say that not in every case. There's some very good, godly people who have lived an exemplary Christian life that suffer. You look at Job there in the Old Testament. Not a more righteous man in all the earth was found. Yet he suffered greatly. He was a righteous man, had boils all over his body, sat in sackcloth and ashes, lost his family, lost his holdings, lost everything. But God would heal him and restore him. And in that day, the Jews believed that no sickness could ever be cured until sin was forgiven. Rabbi Amam said, "There is no death without sin, and no pains without some transgressions." Rabbi Alexander said, "The sick arises not from his sickness until his sins are forgiven." Now, this ancient belief of the Jews has some merit in modern medicine. And there is abundant evidence to prove that the mind does influence the physical condition of the body. And a person cannot have a healthy body with his or her mind is not in a healthy state. Now, the example here, Paul Tournier, in a doctor's case book, quotes an actual example of this. "There was the girl," he says, "of one of my friends who had been treated for several months for anemia without much success. And as a last resort, my colleague decided to send her to the medical officer of the district in which she worked in order to get the permission to send her into a mountain sanatorium." I believe there used to be a sanatorium in Black Mountain where they used to treat that. And then I've read a lot of little places on the mountain. I believe there used to be a big hotel out in Hot Springs that would treat that. But the hotels, they burned right after the other, so I don't see how they stayed in business. But anyway, she would be sent to a mountain sanatorium. Now, a week later, the patient brought word back from the medical officer who had granted the permit. On analyzing the blood, however, I do not arrive at anything like the figures you quote. My friend, somewhat put out at once, took a fresh sample of the blood and rushed it to his laboratory. Sure enough, the blood count had suddenly changed. And he returned to the patient and he asked her, "Has anything out of the ordinary happened in your life since your last visit?" "Yes, something has happened," she replied. "I have suddenly been able to forgive someone against whom I bore a nasty grudge, and all at once I felt I could at last say yes to life." Now her mental attitude was changed, and the very state of her blood was changed along with it. Her mind was cured, her body was well on the way to being cured. Now I think there's something to that. I think if you hold something in, I think if you hold a grudge, or I think if you hold grief in and not let it out, then you are going to suffer physically. You have to let it out. And bearing unforgiveness and grudges is the worst thing in the world for one's health. Well, the scribes were of the opinion that the Lord could not enable the sick man to walk. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts and evil in their hearts, asked them there, as we see in verse 5, "For whether it is easier to say, 'Thy sins be forgiven thee,' or to say, 'Arise and walk'?" Well, they wouldn't answer his question. But if they had answered, they would have had to say, "Well, for us, one is as great as the other." Now, secondly, what would Jesus do? Jesus would challenge prejudice. We see in verses 9 through 13. Matthew, the writer of this gospel, or Levi, he was a publican. I didn't say Republican, but a publican. He was a tax collector. And they were extremely despised. They were extremely hated by the Jews. There was a tax collector in that day that worked for Rome. And what money the Roman government didn't get, they put into their pocket. They were very, very rich men. We must note, now Matthew, he was there at his tax booth there that day. And as we studied in the series on the disciples, he was about as crooked as you could get. And it was miserable. But that day that Jesus passed by, we see what Matthew lost and what Matthew found. Yes, he lost a comfortable job, but he found a destiny. He lost a good income, but he found an honor. As the old saying is, money's not everything. You could have all in the world, and if you don't have Jesus, or if you don't have honor, you have nothing. Now, Luke 5:27 through 29 tells us that Matthew made a great dinner to honor Jesus. We believe that this incident took place at the dinner. As a result of coming to know Jesus, Matthew invited many of his publican friends to this dinner. Now, of course, we see prejudice on the part of the Pharisees. And we see they saw Jesus there eating with Matthew and these other publicans. And they said, well, what is the master or the rabbi doing, eating and cavorting with these low-life scum of the earth, these sinners? A good self-respecting rabbi should never be cavorting with sinners. That's my holy tongue. Yet if you read the Gospels, you see that a good part of the time that Jesus, these were the people that Jesus were with and hung out with. Now, he didn't follow their level of sin. He did not sin. But he was chiding here. Now, his defense, Jesus' defense, was perfectly simple. He simply said that he went where the need was the greatest. And he would say, he would be a poor doctor who visited, he would be a poor doctor who only visited houses where people enjoyed good health. The doctor's place is the house of those who are healed. Now, commonly, unless we go for a checkup, but commonly, when do we go see a doctor? When we have to. When something is wrong with us, when we are sick. And that's what Jesus here is saying. He is going where the need is greatest. We see that Jesus is the great physician. And he has come to heal mankind of his basic problem, which is sin. Going back to the problem of sin and suffering. I still believe that that's a problem with a lot, or causes a lot of the suffering that we see today. Now, you take depression, for instance, and I've been in it a few times. You, I think, could be depressed if there's some sin in the believer's life, or you're not in the will of God. If you're backsliding, I think you can be depressed. And then there are times that I've had what is known as spiritual warfare. Been right where I should be, doing what I should be doing, and yet being just out and out experiencing satanic attack. But we see what Jesus is saying in verse 13, that he did not come to invite people who are so self-satisfied that they're convinced of their own goodness and they don't need anyone's help. He didn't come to the self-righteous because they have no need of a physician. He says, I have come to invite people who are very conscious of their sin and desperately aware of their need for a Savior. Now, thirdly, we see in verses 14 through 17, Jesus would change pride. Now, let me read those verses again. Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not? And Jesus saith unto them, Can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and they shall fast. No man putteth a piece of new cloth into an old garment, for that which is put in to fill it up taketh from the garment, and the rent is made worse. Neither do men put the new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish. but they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. Now, Jesus probably is the most radical here. We see that pride resulted in the traditions, the law of the nation. Jesus said, I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That's why the scribes and the Pharisees despised and hated him so much, because he came and he challenged what they were doing. He challenged their hypocrisy. He knew their hearts. Our Lord is saying this. The old covenant, the old dispensation of law was ending. And he had not come to project it or to continue under that dispensation. He would bring in a new dispensation, that of grace. And actually had come to provide a new garment. And the new garment was the robe of righteousness, which he gives to those who do nothing more than to trust him. Now he talks about the bottles here. Actually, that should be translated wineskins. They were fashioned of animal skin. Looked sort of like a bottle, but they were made of skins there and not glass. And when new wine would be put into a new wineskin, it would expand. But when the old wineskin had reached its limit of expanding, then it would burst open and the wine would be lost. Now what in the world is he saying here? He's saying, I haven't come to sew patches onto an old garment. Now, the old people, I've heard it said, and they were pretty poor, a pair of overalls would have patch on top of patch on top of patch. Because they didn't have the money to buy new ones. So they'd keep patching. They'd patch them things, and they'd probably go down through 2 or 3 generations. That's what that means there, that word picture. He said, I have come to present a new garment, something which is altogether new. This was very radical. John summed it up in his gospel when he said, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. He said he hadn't come to destroy the law. The law was the schoolmaster. The law pointed out sin. But he's coming with the new dispensation of grace. New wine, as it were, for new wineskins. Well, Jesus came to change. His purpose was to change the way things are in our lives. And at the end of the chapter, Jesus challenges us to take off our blinders and see how great the need is for people to join him in the harvest of souls. So we should take up the challenge and allow him to change